with that, without further ado, who wants to introduce our keynote?
Well, I'm going to do this. Why don't we do this? Why don't we say, I'm going to read you the introduction and not name the person. So if you're watching the stream and you can guess their name, you are going to get extra prizes. So drop the name in the chat if you think you know who we have coming up. But this person is an international speaker, panelist, and cloud security thought leader, and advisor with over 11 years of expertise in business risk management and leadership. She's the co-founder and producer of the globally top 100 ranked technology podcast and wildly popular cloud security podcast. She's also a lead program manager at Snyk. She's passionate about making cloud security knowledge accessible through global and local initiatives like the global cloud security and DevOps communities. And with extensive experience in leadership risk management in regulated finance and insurance industries, she's passionate about nurturing future leaders and advocates in cloud security. So any guesses who our amazing keynote speaker is? Okay, we saw a hint there. All right, let's welcome her to the stream. Welcome, Shilpi.
Thank you so much for having. This is quite the crew over here. Thank you for having me, guys.
You know, I realized
I think Shilpi is most famous for yelling at developers.
I know.
Fix your stuff.
Yeah, that could be the meme for 2023, I think.
You know, the one thing I didn't include in the intro, which would have been too much of a giveaway, is that you just hosted the DevSecCon APJ session just, 8 hours ago or so. So yes. First of all, thank you. You did an amazing job. It was so good and so fun.
Thank you. Fun fact, it is 4 a.m. here in Australia. And also this morning when I woke up, I realized all my slides had crashed. So that was so fun. So I've had to, so apologies, they're going to be a bit scrappy, but because I've had to redo them all. But I was like, you know what? This is exactly what my talk is about, open source. And this is what exactly having open source sometimes can feel like when you find out there's a vulnerability and you have to like kind of scram together. So I'm in the right mindset for the talk. But yeah, it was quite a fun morning, middle of the night, let's just say that.
Well, sometimes.
Well, thank you for being such a trooper.
Absolutely.
All good.
Well, without further ado, everyone, we're going to let Shilpi take it away. So Shilpi, thank you so much and excited to hear what you have to say.
Amazing. Thank you, guys. Perfect. Thanks, everyone, for joining. And as I was telling the awesome hosting crew over here, that this morning I did realize when I went into my slides that half of them had disappeared. But I said, you know what, let's just look at it as a positive. And I'm going to put myself in the mind frame of often what happens when you use open source software and you realize that there has been a vulnerability in it, that can leave you scrambling for things at the last minute as well. So, I'm sort of going to channel that a little bit today and probably put that into the ethos. But I think the team has done an amazing job of introducing me. So I'm not going to go into a intro about me. Obviously, if you look me up or Cloud Security Podcast, you should be able to find me. But let's get into it. So what is open source? I think most people attending this talk would be familiar with what open source is, but I just thought I would level the playing field a little bit. I'm also a big Harry Potter fan, so I've tried to put a bit of Harry Potter fun in there just to, sort of keep everyone upbeat. So open source, obviously, as everyone knows, usually would be some sort of a source code that anyone can inspect, modify, or enhance. It's pretty much, software that other people can improve on. Just a couple of quick terminologies. Obviously, you've got people who maintain it, who would be the maintainers, but also there are people you can modify or enhance the software, and you would be normally classified as contributors. There's a couple of sources that I've put on the bottom, which have a lot of information about open source. So if you do want to sort of find out more about open source, do look those up, and they have a lot of information in terms of what open source is all about. So I will leave you to look at those ones. So while we go through the rest of this talk, I would like you to sort of think about this, that how can you protect something that you haven't built and you don't maintain? So that is pretty much what the mindset we've got to be in when we're thinking about open source, because you're using software often which you obviously haven't built, but you're also not maintaining as well. And how can you protect that? You might feel a little bit like Ron Weasley there with his expression. So it may surprise some of you, but may not surprise some of you as well. I think there's been a lot of talk about open source software this year because of, and I'm not going to mention the word we must not mention so far. So 70 to 90% of modern application stacks use open source software. So as you can imagine, that is a lot of our software out there currently that is using open source. On the flip side, it's nearly only half of organizations out there that actually have an open source security policy in place. So a lot of open source software that's being currently used, but only half of it that is currently being secured in organizations, or organizations are thinking about policies to secure that. So what are the reasons why people do use open source? And disclaimer, I am a big supporter of open source. I think it allows for a lot of innovation to happen, a lot of collaboration to happen. It allows a lot of people to be able to create new things because they're building on something that's already amazing that's out there. So there's, if you look at Open UK, which is the body actually governing open source in UK and looking at different things, there's lots of really good reasons why organizations use open source. On the flip side, there are a lot of challenges as well that organizations do have when they're using open source as well. I think often something that you would hear is that there is a cost to using open source, even though it is often a free software that you would be utilizing. There is an inherent cost in terms of things that you would have to put within your organizations, be it in training or resources that you will have to put in place. So I think this slide for me, which is out of that particular report, and again, you can check that out if you want in its entirety, kind of summarizes quite well what are the top benefits and challenges. So what is the real danger with open source software? Obviously, we know it's widely used. We know that a lot of organizations probably don't have a policy in place to maintain it. But just to demonstrate, and there's a lot of examples out there, and I think earlier in the APJ session, there was actually a really good talk where someone actually listed out a GitHub repository that they've got where they've maintained a list of all the open source hacks that have happened or open source vulnerabilities that have been known in the last few years. So I would probably plug that in later at some point. But there have been a lot, but I just wanted to flag a couple. So this is one particular one, and it wasn't so much a breach, but a security researcher was actually able to demonstrate that he was able to attack a lot of these large companies like Apple, Microsoft, PayPal. And what he did is he uploaded a malware to a open source repository, which included things like PyPy, NPM, and Ruby gems. It was automatically distributed downstream. So what happened is anyone who was using this open source repository was able to receive this malicious package automatically, which meant that this would impact their open source software that they were utilizing. So this was something that they demonstrated. Now, obviously, this is something a security researcher had done. So they did advise that, this is what I've done. I understand that he was able to get a bug bounty for this. And I think overall he made, I think, 130,000. That's what I've learned. And also an award from Apple, I think, for sort of doing a responsible disclosure. But that is one of the real dangers, that just using a widely used open source repository, it can sort of, affect a lot of large companies. So a lot of large companies were using these open source repository. Now, he has done a really good blog as well on this, sort of talking through, his the way he was thinking and how he went about it. So there's a really nice blog. I've just popped it on there as well. So if people want to sort of go and have a read of it and really understand what went behind that attack, that is there available for you guys as well. Okay, so before I go into the next slide, I think I'm just going to give a disclaimer warning, because I know this word sort of triggers a lot of people just because, it caused so much stress to all of us end of last year. So a little bit of inner peace, and I'm talking about Log4Shell. So obviously Log4Shell was something that ruined a lot of Christmases last year, and it was a sort of a really good reminder that what open source software, when there is a vulnerability in there, can mean for us. There is a really popular Java logging package, which is your Apache Log4j, and that had a vulnerability which could allow for a remote code execution to happen. And that could be done just with a single malicious code. Now, Log4j is actually really popular. There's been over 400,000 downloads of this particular software. So as you can imagine, it is widely used. And if you were anywhere within DevSecops, security, in a developer landscape, you would have heard about this. So, but I just thought this really sort of drives home the message that there can be real challenges with using open source. And just in terms of the impact from an attack perspective, there were over 100 attempts just in the early days every single day. And in the first week, there were about almost over 800,000 attacks that have happened. So the scale of this can be quite large, going back to that 70 to 90% of organizations actually utilizing open source in their software. So I think I've set the scene for, why open source is something that we should be concerned about. We've open sourced, as I said, but now what? So you can sometimes feel a little bit like the Niffler over here, losing all your gems when you're using open source and all your vulnerabilities, and you find that there is a vulnerability. So I just thought that'll be a good imagery to put you in. So what are the certain things you can do? And I think this is where you might start to notice my slides have gotten a little bit scrappier because these are the ones I've had to redo in the last 10, 15 minutes. So there's a few things out there currently in terms of, sort of looking at open source and how do we sort of attack something like open source to be able to resolve it. So the first thing is community collaboration. So there's a lot of community collaboration that is happening. There is OpenSSF, which is part of the Linux Foundation, and we'll go into that a bit more. There is Project Persia, and you can check that out as well. Again, a community collaboration looking at ways to improve open source. Also government bodies. So the White House has obviously gotten involved with open source with their federal mandate about Sbomb. And as I previously mentioned, there is also Open UK, that is another body that is looking at open source. Just being from Australia, I thought it would be worthwhile just mentioning, we do have an open source industry in Australia as well that is looking after that as well. In terms of tooling, there is a few things that you can do to look at your open source. So you can use static code analysis, a tool like maybe Snyk, and you can complement that with a DAST or a SAST, which is your dynamic or a static application security testing. There are lots of really good frameworks that are coming through. So if you have been watching this since APJ, we did have actually a talk about the Salsa framework and someone who actually went into the complementary GUAC as well. So that is another framework that, a lot of companies have been utilizing to sort of look at their open source and how do they manage that. There is also a secure software architecture from CNCF. So for the purposes of this talk, and because it is a 30-minute talk, I would love to sort of go into all of these, but, there just isn't enough time to do it justice. So I will just be focusing on OpenSSF. So OpenSSF is a governing body that has come together really with a lot of, as you can see, organizations that have decided, what, we do need to do something about open source. Open source is something that is being widely used within our community. And this is something that we need to really come together as a community to address that. And you can see all these companies have come together to sort of take a few initiatives to target, how do we make sure that the open source software that we're utilizing in our programs, in our software, are secure. And I do encourage you guys to just sort of go and look at open source. They have a website which talks a lot about that. But what they have put in place is this this plan, which is called the Open Source Software Security Mobilization Plan. Now, if you look at the components of it, there are 10 components in there, and all of it kind of would make sense to you. So there is things like, security education, looking at risk assessment, looking at the adoption of digital signatures. And I know we've had a talk in the APJ session, and I know Randall, who introduced me as well, he did a talk on, what digital signature and code signing does mean, and, what it does mean for your software as well. About memory safety, incident response, doing better scanning and code audits, data sharing. There's talk about Sbomb in that as well, and also improved software supply chain. So there is a bit to go in there, and they actually do have an entire report that talks through it. Now, just for the purposes of this talk, I would love to sort of dissect each and every part of this, but I've decided to sort of pick 3 top things. I think we're going to be talking about digital signatures. So, what can we do with digital signatures to secure our open source software. When we're talking about code audits, things you can do with your code to secure your open source. And also, I know everyone's probably heard Sbombs quite a bit, but I truly believe it's a conversation that needs to keep happening. So we will sort of delve into Sbombs as well. So those are the three components from the open source software security mobilization plan that we'll be focusing on. So the first one is the digital signature of software. So all the open source software that you consume in your organization, you need to know that what you're consuming is exactly what you are intending to use it for. When someone creates a particular software, then it's modified. Often the challenge is that you do not know what the modifications have been. And if you were intending to use that software for a particular reason, have there been any changes? So what the OpenSSF is suggesting and they're proposing is they want to drive some improvement of these existing signing tools. Now, if you were at KubeCon earlier this year, you may have heard about Sigstore, which is now generally available. So that is one of the tools that is available. And it's really encouraging that adoption of these open source projects to make sure that you know what open source software you're using, who was the author of that, and what are the changes that have been made for that open source software. Now, they're hoping to do this through various different ways. Obviously, adoption of tools is one, but also things like, training for the maintainers, who are a very, very important part of this. And I think I really resonated with something that was said at the KubeCon keynote, that we don't give enough support and probably credit to a lot of these maintainers who are, sort of maintaining these open source softwares, as a side project and out of a labor of love. So just doing more support and training for that. Also, the goal is they are looking at the top 200 projects that are being utilized across the board in various different organizations. And something like a Log4j would have been part of that, and looking at ways to improve software signing for those softwares. So that is one thing that has been recommended. The other one is about third-party code reviews. So looking again at the most critical open source software, by having third-party firms do sort of a code review for these, and doing a report that would be available for everyone to find. So if you're using a particular open source, you will be able to look at that report and understand, are there any vulnerabilities that I need to know of? They are hoping to cover the top 50 in the first year. So that's what they're currently working on. But the intention is that in the next 2.5 years, they'll cover the top 200. So you will be able to sort of go back to this public report that they're going to publish to be able to see, okay, if I'm using, say, a Log4j, what does that code look like? Are there certain things that I need to be aware of as well? Right. And again, Sbomb. So I think, I know I did say this in the APJ session as well, but I've been told that if you say Sbomb 3 times in 2022, a genie appears. So I'm going to see if that genie appears for me. Sbomb, for anyone who isn't familiar, which I don't think there'll be many people in this cohort, but it's just a software bill of materials. I know one of the speakers before gave an example of it being a recipe of a chocolate chip cookie. So it just pretty much everything that goes into your software, what is the ingredient list, as a lot of people have tried to sort of explain it that way. And they're proposing that we need to do things to improve Sbomb tooling and training to drive the adoption. A lot of companies are providing Sbombs these days, but just in terms of, what the qualities of those Sbombs is and how organizations are actually utilizing that Sbomb. At the moment, I think a lot of organizations are still sort of looking at Sbombs going, yes, if I do find that there is a Log4 shell happening and I know one of my softwares uses a Log4j, I can go back to that. So there is that simple sort of trajectory that people are mapping out, but I think what they're proposing is that little bit more sophistication. So working with developers to improve that tooling, also sort of baking in security into a lot of those open source software as well, and sort of baking in that Sbomb. There's also a talk about a lot of education to happen in that space as well. So they've proposed things like, training, having different templates in place, and obviously community advocacy. So just normalizing that everyone who's creating open source or any software is creating Sbombs and also sort of consuming it. Now, Sbomb is something that is mandated in the US by the federal government for anyone who's wanting to sell to the federal government, but it is something that is being advocated in other countries as well. So in UK, there's Open UK. In Australia as well, the government actually encourages companies to have Sbombs and utilize that. So that's all well and good. I know these are initiatives that we're talking about. And the reasons why I wanted to mention these is that for organizations, if you're working with open source software, these are the kind of things you do want to be thinking about. You do want to think about your Sbomb from the software that you're consuming, but also software that you might be distributing. You do want to make sure that the software that you're using has been signed. There is that code signing in place to make sure that the integrity of that software is good. And you also want to look at things like code audits. So at the moment, I know OpenSSF, the report is not out there, but you can be doing certain things to do that code audit. As I mentioned, things like, static code analysis. And if you want to, complement that with a DAST or a SAST. So this is something that the OpenSSF actually have on their website, but this is something called the Open Source Program Office. And there is a lot to go through, but I thought from my perspective, this is a good takeaway slide that I had in mind. And if as an organization, you're looking at this and going, okay, am I really using 70% of my software is open source? And a lot of organizations don't realize how much of their software might be open source. You may be thinking, okay, I appreciate that something like an OpenSSF is working on these projects, but what are the certain things that I can do today to be able to sort of, look at these things? Because, I cannot be waiting, say, a year to start doing certain things. And I think this slide that they've got over there, kind of summarizes it quite well. So these are real actionable things that you can put in place today to look at how you can improve your open source security. So obviously focusing on education, I think it's one of those really simple things that we often talk about, but it's definitely not to be underrated, talking about this within your organization and making sure that everyone understands what the implications of using open source. It definitely allows you to move faster and innovate. But on the flip side, we do need to know what the cost of doing that is. Multi-factor authentication, I know we had a really good talk from Okta about that as well. Again, that is one of those things that, it's worthwhile implementing, just making sure things are secure. You're using a combination of tools in your pipeline to detect these vulnerabilities. So OpenSSF actually has a guide for security tools. So if you go on there, they kind of talk about different tools, but the takeaway message is, no tool is perfect. It kind of has to complement, the culture that you've got within your organization and what you're using it for. So there wouldn't be one tool fits all in this case, but, that is something that you can do. We spoke about, adopting something like a SIG store or a code signing as well. The software bill of material adoption. Then you want to obviously monitor your overall health of the open source projects that you're using as well. So the Linux Foundation actually has this thing called LFX that you can utilize, and they also have a chaos toolkit. So yes, what I'll probably do is, so I did have a resource slide at the end of this, but obviously as I've had this great experience today, I will pop these resources into the DevSecOn Discord channel, all the resources that you can kind of go into to be able to sort of, look at all this information and implement it in your organization. There are also some really great guidelines that are available as well. So in a nutshell, I think what I wanted to really sort of wrap up with is open source is great. I am very supportive of people utilizing open source. It is great for innovation, but it does come with its own costs. And there are some great initiatives that are happening across the board, and OpenSSF being one of the big ones out there currently. So I do encourage everyone to go check that out. Look at their open mobilization plan. I've obviously flagged only 3 of the components, but I think each of the components that they're speaking about, and I will kind of maybe just flick back to that, are equally important. And I do encourage everyone to look at that and sort of implementing something like that within their organizations. Thank you so much for everyone's time.
Well, Shilpi, thank you so much for that
Shilpi.
presentation. That was incredible.
Thank you. Hopefully I did all right for time. I was trying to kind of keep a track on, am I going over or not?
You did fantastic. Yep.
This is how I imagine you say Sbomb.
Yes, I was trying to sort of, like maybe not say Sbomb enough. I think there's like few buzzwords for 2022, which, you kind of like don't want to say it, but I think I think someone said that, things are a buzzword for a reason sometimes. And I think Sbomb's one of them.
Yeah.
Yeah, and bringing up
Fair
Log4Shell
point.
so close to the holidays again, or so close to the anniversary.
Yeah.
I
Very
know.
risky. Very risky.
That's why I thought a disclaimer was appropriate.
Yeah.
One of the things I always
Yeah.
find super just fascinating about open source and security in general is I think about this often, but like apparently, and I just Googled this to make sure I'm not going to give anyone some fake information here. But Isaac Newton is the one who said, "If I have seen further, it is by standing on the shoulders of giants," which is one of my favorite quotes of all time. And I feel like in the software world, it's like one of the most relevant things to, literally everything we do, because when you're building applications today, you're using so much work that people that have come before you have built, and it's all just open source stuff all the way down to the kernels of the operating systems that you're working on most of the time. And it's just so impressive how much like the collective human knowledge and like sharing of that knowledge has like enabled for today's stuff. But it doesn't come without risk, and there's all sorts of things you need to do to use those tools in nice ways and make sure you're not like breaking things and causing problems. But absolutely loved your presentation.
Thank you so much.
Yeah,
Cool.
100%. I see
Thanks, Shilpi.
in the over on the Hopin platform, Hannah said that's fantastic talk as well, Shilpi. However, Hannah's a little disappointed, and I agree with Hannah. There was no genie that popped up when you said S-bomb 3 times.
I know. I was hoping for that. I think one of these days, maybe I need to say it 10 times. I think maybe it's not 3.
Yes. Awesome.
Perfect.
Any other questions for Shilpi?
I think I have a genie image. Here we go. That kind of looks like a genie.
I love that. I think I'll need that for my next talk. The third time I say it, Brian Clark pops up.
The beardless Brian Clark. Also, we got to talk about Micah's photoshopping skills there, because I don't know what he did to my face, but it looked really choppy and everything. And I feel
I
didn't know I had such a
Face is your
lumpy
face,
head,
man.
Micah.
I can't help with that.
I have such a lumpy head. All right, awesome. Where do we go from here? Where do we go from here now?
Now
Right?
you've just made it awkward, Brian.
Yeah,
Well-
I do a really good job at that. So thanks for having me.
Well, Shilpi, thank you for joining us, and thanks for dropping some great open source knowledge on everyone. If people want to connect with you, what's the best way for them to get in touch? Do you have anything you want to plug?
Yes, so I think, if you look up Cloud Security Podcast, I think you should be able to find us. I'm usually on LinkedIn is probably the best way to find me, but I also do hang out on the DevSecOn Discord as well, and that's where I'll be popping in the handy links for this talk. So yeah, that's another place you can find me.
Amazing. Well, Shilpi, thank you so much for coming, and we will talk to you later. Take care.
Thank you. All the best.